The folder was labeled Administrative Logistics Q3, Ceremonial Coordination, Routine. Nothing about that label was supposed to matter. Routine folders didn't get read twice. They got initialed, stacked, and moved to the archive trolley by Thursday afternoon without anyone losing sleep over their contents. Clara Brent had been a junior regimental clerk for 2 years and 4 months. She knew the difference between a folder that needed attention and one that simply needed filing. She had developed the particular instinct that comes from handling paper all day, the way a postal worker knows a letter is wrong before they've read the address. Something about the weight, something about the silence a document carries when it has been placed somewhere it shouldn't be. She found it on a Tuesday morning in early October, tucked between a catering requisition for the trooping rehearsal and a parking allocation memo for Horse Guards parade. A single document, cream paper, burgundy header, classification stripe running diagonally across the upper right corner, in a shade of red, she had only ever seen on documents that came through the restricted channel. It was not supposed to be in a routine folder, not even close. She didn't pull it out immediately. She set the folder down on her desk, smoothed the edge of the catering requisition as though that were the reason she had paused, and looked at the burgundy header from the corner of her eye, the way you look at something in a dark room when you aren't sure yet whether you want to know what it is. Palace Operational Directive, Forecourt Ceremonial Positioning Review, Restricted Distribution, Action Required by 14 November. She read it once. Then she read it again, more slowly. The way you reread something when you are hopping the second reading will change what the first one said. It didn't. The directive, 3 pages long and dense with administrative language, outlined a permanent repositioning of the Queen's Guard. The sentries currently posted at the 2 ground-level sentry boxes on Buckingham Palace forecourt, positions that had existed in their current form since 1959, were to be relocated, moved back, placed behind the iron railings rather than forward of them, flush with the palace facade, separated from the public by the full width of the forecourt, and a set of Victorian ironwork that had, until this document existed, simply been decorative. The stated reason, printed in clean bureaucratic font as though it were as unremarkable as a schedule change, was enhanced crowd management and streamlined tourist flow during peak ceremonial periods. Clara sat with that phrase for a long moment. Enhanced crowd management. She had stood on that forecourt herself during her first week in the role. She had watched the sentries hold their positions while tourists pressed against them, photographed them from 6 inches away, waved hands in front of their faces, and occasionally touched the barrels of their rifles under the impression that no response would come. The sentries had not flinched, not one of them. They had held their ground, not because they were permitted to, but because holding that specific ground was precisely what the position meant. Moving them behind the railings didn't solve a crowd management problem. It surrendered the ground to the crowd. Clara understood the difference. She suspected the people who had written this directive understood it too. She suspected that was exactly why it had been written in language designed to make the distinction invisible. She did not put the document back in the routine folder. She placed it in a sealed internal envelope, wrote a single line on the front, misfiled. Requires restricted handling. CB, and walked it down the corridor to the records office, where she handed it to the senior archivist without making eye contact and returned to her desk. Then she opened her personal address book, found a number she had only ever used once before, and wrote a very short email from her private account on her lunch break. She didn't explain everything. She didn't need to. There is a directive in circulation you should probably see. I can't send it, but I think you know someone who can find it through proper channels. I think this matters. She pressed send before she could talk herself out of it. By the time she initialed the last of the afternoon's routine folders, the email had already been forwarded twice. Edward Hartwell read the forwarded message at his desk in Wiltshire at 7:30 in the evening, with a cup of tea going cold beside his reading lamp, and the kind of stillness around him that settles over old houses in October when the heating hasn't been turned on yet. He had retired from active regimental service 11 years ago. He had left with 2 commendations, a set of dress uniform he still kept pressed out of habit, and the absolute certainty that he was done with institutional politics forever. He had meant it genuinely. He had built a quiet life around meaning it. He read the message 3 times. Then he picked up his phone and made the first of 3 calls. The first was to a serving warrant officer at Wellington Barracks who owed him nothing but picked up on the second ring anyway. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. By the end of it, Hartwell had confirmed that the directive was real, that it had already cleared 2 levels of administrative approval, and that no formal regimental objection had been logged, because no one in the formal chain had been shown the document before it was signed. That last detail sat in his chest like something cold. The second call was to a retired brigadier now working in heritage law who explained, in the measured tones of someone who had spent 30 years translating institutional action into legal consequence, that a repositioning of this nature, if it touched ground formally designated under the 1959 Ceremonial Placement Charter, would require regimental consent that did not appear to have been sought. The third call was the shortest, a former regimental sergeant major, now in his 70s, who listened to the entire summary without interrupting and then said only, "They moved them behind the railings. They finally did it." Not with surprise, with the particular exhaustion of someone who had been waiting for a thing to happen and had hoped they would be wrong. Hartwell sat for a while after that third call. Outside, the Wiltshire dark had fully settled. The tea was completely cold. He thought about the forecourt as he had last seen it, the sentries at their positions, forward of the railings, standing on ground that was technically palace property but practically a statement. A daily, wordless, completely serious statement that this institution did not retreat, that it held its ground regardless of inconvenience. That the inconvenience, in fact, was part of the point. He thought about what it would look like now. The same uniforms, the same stillness, the same absolute refusal to acknowledge the public pressing against the ironwork, but behind the railings, set back, the crowd technically in front of them. He booked the 7:14 train to Paddington before he went to bed. He did not sleep particularly well. By the time the train pulled into the capital the following morning, he had read the full directive, obtained through proper channels by the warrant officer who had stayed up to pull it. He had annotated it in pencil in the margins, not with emotion, but with the systematic precision of someone building a case from existing evidence. 17 annotations, each one a question that the document's language had been specifically constructed not to answer. He stepped off the train at Paddington with his annotated copy, his retired officer identification, and the absolute composure of a man who had decided, somewhere between Swindon and Reading, that he was not going to raise his voice once during what was about to happen. The regimental administrative offices occupied a set of rooms on the 2nd floor of a building near Horse Guards that managed to be both impressive and deliberately forgettable. The kind of space that communicated authority through restraint, dark wood paneling, framed regimental portraits, carpets thick enough to absorb the sound of difficult conversations. Hartwell had spent years in rooms exactly like this. He knew their grammar. He signed in at the front desk under the standing veterans consultation protocol, which entitled any retired officer of his rank to request a scheduled review of regimental records pertaining to their period of service. It was a procedural right that had existed for decades and was almost never used, because almost no one had reason to use it. The duty clerk, young, professionally cautious, checked his credentials twice and offered him a seat in the waiting area with the practiced warmth of someone who had been trained to be pleasant to visitors, while quietly alerting their supervisor that an unexpected one had arrived. Hartwell sat in the waiting area for 11 minutes. He used the time to observe. The office was running at its normal Tuesday pace. Clerks moving between desks. A junior officer carrying a stack of folders toward the archive room. Someone on a telephone in the far corner speaking in the careful, neutral tone that meant the call was being monitored or the subject was sensitive, possibly both. But there were other signals, smaller ones. A clerk who had glanced at him from across the room and then looked away too quickly. A door that had been open when he arrived and was now closed. The duty clerk who had checked his credentials twice, making a note on a pad and then turning it face down on her desk. The institution knew he was here. It had been informed before he'd finished signing in. That was fine. He hadn't come to surprise anyone. What he had come to do was trace a decision trail. He knew from the warrant officer's report that the directive had been processed through the administrative controller's office. He knew it had been signed off by someone with authority over ceremonial logistics, but below the level of the regimental colonel-in-chief, which meant it had been moved through a deliberate gap, above the level of the serving officers who would have objected, and below the level of the authority who would have required proper consultation. That gap had a name. It was called efficiency when it worked, and a procedural failure when it didn't. What it was called when it was done on purpose was something the documentation was careful never to specify. He spent 40 minutes in the records room reviewing the administrative log. He did not remove any documents. He photographed 3 pages with the small digital camera he had brought in his briefcase, which was permitted under the Veterans Consultation Protocol for records pertaining to his own service period. 2 of the 3 pages did not pertain to his service period, but they pertained to the same positions he had stood in during his service period, and he was prepared to make that argument calmly and at length if challenged. He was not challenged. By the time he left the records room, he had what he needed, a clear sequence, who had initiated the review, who had drafted the directive, who had approved it without regimental notification, and the name of the man who had personally signed the action order that moved the whole process from proposal to implementation. Deputy Controller Gerald Foss, career civil servant, 17 years in palace administrative service, never served in a regiment, never stood on a forecourt, never, as far as Hartwell could determine from the documentation, visited the sentry positions he had just permanently repositioned. Hartwell closed his briefcase, thanked the records clerk with genuine courtesy, and asked the duty officer at the front desk whether Deputy Controller Foss happened to be in the building today. There was a pause that lasted slightly too long to be natural. "He is, yes. Did you have an appointment?" "No," Hartwell said pleasantly, "but I believe he'll want to see me. You can tell him it's regarding the forecourt repositioning. He'll know what that means." He sat back down in the waiting area. This time he waited for 23 minutes. He used the time to review his annotations. When the door to the inner corridor finally opened, the junior officer standing in it had the particular expression of someone who had been sent to collect a problem they hadn't been told the full size of. Gerald Foss's office was on the building's interior, no windows facing the street. A deliberate choice, Hartwell suspected, made by a man who had spent enough years in palace administration to understand that offices without external views were offices without external witnesses. Foss was standing when Hartwell entered. That was the first signal. A man who sits when a visitor arrives is a man on his own ground. A man who stands is a man who has been warned. He was in his mid-50s, silver-haired, a jacket that fit well and a tie that matched the carpet in the way that things in institutions often matched each other without anyone planning it. He had the smooth, measured energy of someone accustomed to managing situations from behind a desk, the kind of composure that was trained rather than natural, and that occasionally cracked along the training lines when pushed in the right direction. Hartwell set his briefcase down, took the offered chair without being formally invited to sit, and placed his annotated copy of the directive on the desk between them like a document being entered into evidence. "I appreciate the time," he said. "I'll be direct." Foss glanced at the annotated directive. His composure held, but his eyes moved slightly faster than the rest of his face. "I'm not sure what you think you found," he said. This was a standard operational review, processed through normal administrative channels. Hartwell looked at him steadily. "Which channels specifically?" "Because the 1959 placement charter requires regimental sign-off on any repositioning of standing ceremonial positions. I've reviewed the approval log. There is no regimental signature. The charter applies to structural changes. This was a positional adjustment for operational reasons." Foss's voice was smooth, practiced. He had clearly anticipated this specific point. "A positional adjustment that permanently moves sovereign ceremonial ground behind iron railings," Hartwell said, "is not a logistics footnote. The public safety rationale is well documented. We had 3 crowd-related incidents on the forecourt in the last 18 months. 2 required medical attendance." Hartwell nodded slowly. "I read the incident reports. A tourist sprained an ankle stepping backward for a photograph. A child was briefly separated from a parent during changing of the guard. These are not security crises. These are the entirely predictable consequences of operating a public ceremonial function in a city of 9 million people." "We have a duty of care," Foss said, and his voice had taken on a slight edge, the first one. "To the public and to the serving personnel." The serving personnel did not request this change. Hartwell kept his voice completely flat. "I checked. No formal request. No informal petition. No incident report from any sentry citing personal safety concerns about their forecourt position. This decision was made for them, not by them or with them." Foss straightened slightly. "You're a retired officer. With respect, you're not part of the current operational chain." "No," Hartwell agreed pleasantly. "I'm not. Which is exactly why I can say this without it being a career problem. The men standing on that forecourt can't. That's rather the point of my being here." There was a silence. Foss picked up a pen, set it down again. "This is a modernization. It's in keeping with how other European royal ceremonial functions have adapted over time." Hartwell looked at him for a moment with the kind of patience that is indistinguishable from pity. "You just used the word modernization to describe moving guards behind a fence because tourists were getting too close to them." Hartwell leaned forward very slightly. "I'd like you to say that sentence again, but without the word modernization. Say what it actually is." Foss raised his voice. "Just slightly. Enough. It is an operational repositioning based on documented risk assessment, and it has been properly approved through the relevant administrative pathway." Hartwell reached into his briefcase and produced a second document. This one he did not set down casually. He held it by its edge and placed it precisely in front of Foss. "Then perhaps you can explain," he said, "why the relevant administrative pathway did not include the regimental colonel-in-chief. Because this," he said, tapping the document once, "is his standing signature authority over all changes to ceremonial positioning. And this," he tapped the approval log, "is a list of every signature obtained. His is not among them." The silence that followed was a different quality from the one before. Foss's composure did not collapse. Men like Foss did not collapse. But something shifted behind his eyes, some internal adjustment, the moment when a man stops arguing and starts calculating. "The approval was obtained at the appropriate level for this category of change," he said, and his voice was carefully level again now, deliberately drained of the edge it had briefly carried. Hartwell picked up his annotated directive and put it back in his briefcase. "Then I suppose," he said, "we'll see what the appropriate level turns out to mean when someone asks the colonel-in-chief directly." He stood, buttoned his jacket with the unhurried precision of a man who had nothing left to prove in this particular room, and collected his briefcase. "I'd suggest," he said at the door, "that you inform your assistant to clear the next 2 hours. I have a feeling the afternoon is going to require your full attention." He closed the door behind him, not loudly, quietly, the kind of quiet that makes more noise than a slam. They met again 40 minutes later in a larger room, a conference room this time with an oval table and too many chairs, and the kind of institutional lighting that made everyone look slightly unwell. Foss had brought a legal advisor. Hartwell had brought nothing except the briefcase and the annotations. The legal advisor opened with procedure. She was precise, fast, and clearly intelligent. She outlined the administrative pathway in detail, cited 3 precedents for positional adjustments made without full charter review, and made a clean, structured argument that the 1959 placement charter contained a specific provision for operational modifications that did not require senior sign-off if the modification met a defined threshold of impermanence. It was a good argument. Hartwell gave it the silence it deserved before responding. "You've argued the letter of the charter," he said. "I'm interested in something different. The question I want answered isn't whether this was technically permissible. The question is why it was done this way. Because the way it was done, quietly, below the level of those who would have objected, in language carefully calibrated to describe a retreat as a modernization, tells you something that the legal argument specifically avoids." Foss cut in. "We are not retreating. We are adapting to a contemporary operational environment." Hartwell turned to look at him directly. "When a soldier moves backward from a position he previously held," he said, "we don't call it adaptation. We call it giving ground. The name doesn't change what happened." The legal advisor shifted her papers. "Emotional language doesn't resolve a procedural question." "No," Hartwell agreed, "but procedural language doesn't resolve a moral one." He opened his briefcase and removed a photograph, printed that morning at the hotel near Paddington where he had stayed the night before. He set it on the table without ceremony. It was a photograph of the forecourt, recent. The sentries behind the railings, positioned exactly as the directive had specified, tourists in front of them, the iron bars between them and the palace facade they were meant to be guarding. "Look at it," he said, "not at the text of the charter, at that." Nobody spoke. "This is the image the directive produced," he continued. 2 Queen's Guards standing with perfect composure, in full ceremonial dress, separated from the public by an iron fence, visible from the street as something to be photographed from the other side of a barrier, like an exhibit, like something that needs protecting from the people looking at it. The legal advisor started to speak. He raised one hand, not rudely, just precisely. "For 6 decades," he said, "those positions communicated something specific, that this institution does not hide behind its own architecture, that the guard stands forward, that the ground in front of the palace is not surrendered to spectacle. That was not incidental. It was deliberate. It was the entire point. And the decision to end that was made by someone who never stood in those positions and never had to." Foss's voice was quiet now. The edge was completely gone. "We had incidents. We had liability exposure. We had a duty to respond." "You had inconvenience," Hartwell said, and he kept every trace of contempt out of his voice, which required more discipline than anything else in the conversation. "Minor, manageable, entirely predictable inconvenience that has existed in some form since the positions were established. And you responded to it by moving the guards back." He looked at Foss steadily. "That is an admission. Whatever language you use to describe it, the image on this table is what the admission looks like." The silence that followed was longer than the others. The legal advisor looked at her papers. Foss looked at the photograph. The institutional heating moved air quietly through the ceiling vents. "You can file a formal objection through the regimental record," the legal advisor said eventually, her voice professional and completely neutral. "That avenue is available to you." Hartwell nodded once. "I'm aware." He closed his briefcase. He was about to stand when the conference room door opened without a knock. Major General Sir Thomas Beckford did not look like a man who had just driven up from Hampshire. He looked like a man who had been expecting to make this trip for some time and had dressed accordingly. Navy suit, regimental tie, a bearing so deeply ingrained it had long since stopped being a choice and become simply the way he inhabited space. He carried a slim leather document wallet and an expression that had no temperature at all. He did not look at Foss when he entered. He looked at the photograph on the table. He stood in the doorway looking at it for exactly long enough that everyone in the room understood he had seen it and understood what it meant. Then he sat down at the head of the table, placed his document wallet in front of him, and opened it without any preamble whatsoever. He produced a single document, not a copy, the original, on paper that had aged to the particular cream color of something that had been properly stored for several decades. He laid it flat in the center of the table and smoothed it once with the palm of his hand. Ceremonial Placement Charter, Buckingham Palace Forecourt and adjacent sovereign ceremonial ground, established by regimental authority and royal warrant, January 1959. He did not read it aloud. He let them read it themselves. He waited with the absolute patience of someone who had nothing to prove and no deadline to meet. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet and carried exactly as far as the room required. The positions established under this charter, he said, were not established for the convenience of the regiment, or for the management of tourist traffic, or for the reduction of administrative liability. He looked at Foss. They were established as a formal expression of ceremonial sovereignty. The ground in front of those sentry boxes is not public ground that the regiment occupies. It is sovereign ceremonial ground. There is a distinction. It is not a subtle one. Foss opened his mouth. Beckford continued without adjusting his pace or volume. The operational directive process through your office moved serving personnel from sovereign ceremonial ground to a position behind a physical boundary. That is not a positional adjustment within the meaning of the charter. It is a relinquishment of ceremonial standing. It required my signature. He tapped the charter once. It did not receive it. The legal advisor said carefully, the pathway used was consistent with previous modifications classified as operational. Major General Beckford looked at her. She stopped speaking. He reached into the document wallet again and produced a second page. This one was a typed letter brief with a date at the top from 3 days prior. I became aware of this directive, he said, through channels that should not have been necessary. A junior clerk who recognized that a document had been misfiled. A retired officer who took a morning train from Wiltshire because no one currently serving could say what he was able to say without professional consequence. He set the letter on the table beside the charter. I will not be revering the repositioning today. That process requires time and formal documentation, and I will not have it done quickly in a way that mirrors the way it was done in the first place. He looked at Foss directly. But I will tell you what I am doing today. I am entering a formal regimental objection into the permanent record. I am commissioning a full procedural review of the approval pathway used, and I am requesting, in writing, that the Administrative Controller's Office provide a complete account of why the charter signature requirement was not raised at any point during this directive's preparation. He closed the document wallet. The men standing on that forecourt hold those positions as a living institutional statement. They are not decorative. They are not a tourist attraction. They are not a liability to be managed. He paused. The moment we start treating them as any of those things, we have already lost something that no subsequent repositioning will recover. He stood, looked once more at the photograph on the table. The positions will be restored through the correct process, he said. In the meantime, the record will reflect what happened here and why. He looked at Foss one final time. Some decisions cannot be quietly corrected. They can only be honestly documented. He picked up his document wallet, nodded once to Hartwell, and left the room without looking at anyone else. The door closed behind him without a sound. The conference room took a long moment to remember how to function after Beckford left it. The legal advisor gathered her papers with the careful, methodical movements of someone who needed something to do with her hands. Foss remained seated, looking at the charter on the table, his expression stripped of its administrative smoothness, left with something underneath that was harder to name and considerably less comfortable to look at. Hartwell stood, buttoned his jacket, and lifted his briefcase. He paused at the door, not for effect, simply because there was one thing left to say that was worth saying. No one in this building wanted this change, he said. Not the clerks, not the serving officers, not the men standing the positions. They couldn't say so in writing without it becoming a career question. That's why it was processed at the level it was processed at. He looked at Foss without hostility. I understand the pressure you were operating under. I don't think this was straightforwardly cynical. I think it was the kind of decision that happens when institutions start managing their own dignity, the way they manage their liability exposure. He picked up the photograph from the table and held it for a moment. That, he said, is when they start losing both. He left the photograph on the table and walked out. The administrative corridor was quiet in the particular way that institutional spaces go quiet when something irrevocable has just happened inside them. Clerks at their desks, a door open onto a room full of filing cabinets, the distant sound of a telephone ringing and being answered on the second ring. Hartwell walked through it with no expression and no pace change. The way he had walked through dozens of institutional corridors in dozens of buildings during a career that had required him to be the calmest person in a significant number of uncomfortable rooms. At the front desk, the duty clerk, the same one who had checked his credentials twice that morning, looked up as he signed out. There was something different in her expression now. Not warmth exactly, something more like recognition. He handed back his visitor badge, thanked her by name because he had noticed her name on the desk plaque when he arrived, and stepped out into the gray October afternoon. London did its usual thing of existing at full volume the moment he pushed through the door. Buses, black cabs cutting across the intersection, a cluster of tourists with wheeled luggage navigating the pavement with the cheerful obliviousness of people on holiday in a city that has no patience for obliviousness. He turned toward the palace end of the road without making a particular decision to do so, just the way his feet moved. He could see the forecourt from the end of the street, the railings, the sentries in their positions behind them, crimson tunics vivid against the pale stone of the facade, bearskins absolutely still in the October air, perfect as they always were, completely composed as they had always been, giving nothing away, acknowledging nothing, holding a stillness that the city moved around without touching. He did not walk up to the railings. He stood at the far end of the pavement and looked for a moment the way you look at something you needed to see, but didn't need to be closer to. The formal objection would be entered into the regimental record that week. He had been told as much before he left the building. 3 paragraphs, permanent, unamendable, citing the procedural failures and recording the regimental position with the particular precision that institutional language uses when it is required to be completely honest. The positions would be restored, eventually, through the correct process. Beckford had said so, and Beckford was not a man who said things he didn't mean. But that was later. Today the sentries were still behind the railings. Today the photograph on the conference room table was still the accurate one. Hartwell stood on the pavement for exactly long enough to register that clearly. Not with grief, not with anger, just with the steady, sober attention of someone who believed that the honest record of a loss was itself a form of preservation. That nomming a thing correctly, refusing to call a retreat a modernization, refusing to call a relinquishment an adaptation, insisting in writing and on record that what had happened, was sometimes the only form of resistance available, and was therefore the one that mattered most. A group of tourists moved past him toward the railings, phones already raised. One of them asked her companion whether the guards were allowed to move, and her companion said they didn't think so, and they both laughed pleasantly and took photographs from the other side of the iron bars. The sentries didn't move. Of course they didn't. That was never going to change regardless of where they were standing. The composure, the absolute refusal to acknowledge the spectacle being made of their presence, that was not a function of position. That was something else entirely. Something that no directive had touched and no administrative repositioning was ever going to reach. Hartwell turned and walked back toward the tube station. He had a 5:40 back to Wiltshire. The flat needed heating, and the tea this time, he decided, was going to be made before he sat down to read anything. Behind him, without ceremony, without acknowledgement, in full view of 100 tourists and several camera lenses and the entire indifferent machinery of a city going about its Tuesday, the Queen's Guard held their ground. Different ground than yesterday, but theirs. Still entirely, completely, absolutely theirs. The railings had changed a position. They had not changed what the position meant to the people standing in it. And somewhere in the permanent regimental record, in 3 precise and unamendable paragraphs, that distinction would now exist forever. Sometimes that was the most important victory of all. The kind that nobody photographed. The kind that nobody saw. The kind that was won entirely in the historical record by people who understood that the record was the last honest thing an institution had left when everything else had been managed, adjusted, and quietly moved behind a fence.